I'm John Warren, and I'm a medical doctor and also did scientific research. I did my research at mostly Hammersmith Hospital, National Heart and Lung, and used to running basic pharmacology scientific experiments there, and also human experimentation, including setting up phase 1 and phase 2 experiments. And then in 1995, I moved into drug regulation with the MHRA in the UK and spent a lot of that time in Europe because the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, came to Canary Wharf just as I started. So I had a huge exposure, a wonderful exposure to drug development at all stages during the assessment process, but particularly during scientific advice. The Scientific Advice Working Party in Europe produces a great background of expertise, advising companies as to how they should develop their programs. In this exposure, you could see a lot of mistakes being made and a lot of great progress. And so it gave you a huge overview of the exciting areas of pharmacological research that are going on at the moment. So clinical pharmacology really started post-Second World War. There was an option, instead of being drafted into the Army, Air Force and so forth, in the United States as part of the Korean War and Vietnam War experience. From 1953 onwards, you could take an NIH associate program and help the government develop research. And a lot of people thought it'd be interesting to go into drug-based research at that time. This lasted for 20 years and gave a huge academic boost to pharmacology and clinical pharmacology at a time when the importance of chemistry in drug development was being very much appreciated. So there's a great benefit to drug development in the 1950s and 60s. This continued through the 70s and 80s, and in the 80s and 90s, well over 100 products were coming up for approval. And things were looking very rosy. Up until about 1996, there were about 130 new compounds coming up worldwide that were innovative medicines, and about 30 to 40% of these were being approved by the regulators. But then, gradually, this tailed off until about 2010. The number of new compounds coming up had dramatically fallen to just over 30. Now, you might say this is just a very tough regulatory environment, but the passing rate by the regulator had doubled over this time. So it wasn't a tougher regulatory environment, and it requires an explanation as to why productivity had declined so much until about 3 years ago. I think the major reason for this is the diversion of funds into genetics. Genetics had a huge boost around the time of the Human Genome Project, and this was the sexy thing to do in research, and it meant that not many people were interested in basic pharmacology, physiology and chemistry and wanted to get into genetics. Huge exposure of research money into this area, but it hasn't really come up with the new drugs that were promised. So since 2010 there's been a gradual pick-up in medicine's development as people have gone back to appreciate the importance of chemistry, basic science, and getting drugs into man for the first time, looking at phase 1, and very slowly we're picking back up to rediscover that the most important part of drug discovery is the phase 2 development program. So there wasn't a lot of interest in phase 1 development because it was going quite well. Each company had their own program, usually on site where they were based, and very active in the UK. But as it started to tail off, and particularly when people were going offshore and outsourcing, people started to question whether they were doing it right because the activity levels had started to decline. And then we came along with TGN 1412, this great disaster which you may remember when 6 young men almost died from the first dose in man. And this caused a great interest in phase 1. So we saw 10 years ago an explosion of the number of conferences dealing with phase 1 just to make sure that people didn't make similar mistakes. But it's taken a long time for people to recognise that actually phase 2 is the area in exciting innovative drug research where the real science is made that makes or breaks a drug. Too much emphasis has been passed by the finance people and the marketing people. Let's get straight on to phase 3 and stop wasting time with minor experiments. A lot of the time people are dealing with Me Too drugs and phase 2 is not so important. But for true innovation, really good, important drugs for humanity, maybe not so good for the balance sheet, and phase 2 is crucial. So over the past 10 years, we were seeing a steady decline in the quality and amount of phase 1 work, and phase 2 had taken a severe hit. Since TGM 1412, there's been a lot more interest in the quality of the phase 1 work, but at the same time we've had the Clinical Trials Directive, which has been immensely unpopular in Europe, and people have used that as a reason to say this is why we don't do clinical trials in man so readily as we used to. A lot of academics have also found it a considerable burden. But gradually that is lifting. The Clinical Trials Directive in Europe has been reviewed, and activity is definitely picking up. I think the future looks very optimistic. Whereas phase 2 has been very slow to come around, and it's very difficult to convince people this is such an important area. But I think it will come good again, particularly with the great developments in drug assays we have now, particularly mass spec, where we can run the drug profile, the pharmacokinetics, against the pharmacodynamic profile, and PK/PD modelling has definitely picked up and stimulated a lot of interest in phase 2. A key question here is what is drug innovation? And you might think, oh yeah, that's just people in white coats standing around in labs and coming up with new drugs that are going to help everybody. But this is a naive view, because it leads to confusion about goals and aims of the people who are involved in the work. Let us suppose that we were going to hospital and we needed an anaesthetic. We'd be very interested indeed to make sure that there were perfectly good, safe, effective drugs to put us asleep, have as painkillers, and have antibiotics available. These are crucial for human benefit, and this is what most people think of as being drug innovation. Let's suppose also we were fancying retiring on a decent pension, and our pension funds are invested in the pharmaceutical industry. We may be less keen, for example, in developing a new drug that might be an effective anti-malarial in 12 or 15 years' time, perhaps much better to protect our future pension pot, to come up with drugs that are in a proven area with Me Too compounds, and try and get maximum exposure to patient numbers, maximum duration in terms of duration of therapy, and a decent return on the investment. And those are perfectly valid aims to have, but they shouldn't be confused with the sort of drugs that have led to revolutions in people's well-being. And the third area, of course, is the academic, and the academic can't stop thinking like an academic. They're thinking in terms of the next paper, next conference, letting people know their results, and in terms of their career and raising grant money. And although this may then lead on to new drugs, there is a difficulty in getting this transition between the academic findings and the academic way of thinking into the commercial area, a huge area for potential improvement.